Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Parallel Systems broadcast. Thank you for watching tonight. We are doing a live stream. We're going to be talking about the collapse of sovereign debt, and we're going to specifically be looking at Japan, the land of the rising sun and the land of the collapsing sovereign debt market by the look of it. And I really do think Japan is at the forefront of what we're seeing because they've got some interesting quirks. One of them is that in terms of developed nations, they've got the largest debt to GDP in the world. We're talking over 260%. In fact, I have no idea what it is now. I haven't checked in the last 15 minutes for all I know. It's 300%, 500%. Who knows? Because they are a basket case over there. And of course, this began with the Japanese bubble, which was the 1980s. They had the Nikkei bubble and also a real estate bubble. So it was like a forerunner of the everything bubble. And when that collapsed, Japan had chronic deflation. And the way that they tried to get out of that was by implementing some of these then exotic tools, but they're now pretty much being used across the West. And it was debt monetization. So you had the Bank of Japan buying up pretty much everything and anything that the government printed in terms of debt. And you also had them buying up the stock market through a rudimentary form of quantitative easing. So they were buying ETFs and baskets of companies. And they were essentially keeping this whole Ponzi scheme over there in Japan afloat. So it's a very interesting system, and people would look on and say, how the hell does that country continue? How do they keep the train on the track with a debt to GDP of 260%? But it was working because they had deflation, and people thought, well, let's let sleeping dogs lie. But those dogs have now awoken, and those dogs are angry. We've got inflation back, we've got a collapsing yen, we've got soaring inflation, we've got people who are very upset over there because they can't afford their rice, which is a staple food. So we're going to be getting into all of that tonight, my friends. So let's start with this article I've got in front of me. The first one is Japan to consider buying back some super long government bonds. Now, you'll know if you've been watching the channel or simply watching anything to do with bonds in the last few weeks that the long dated bonds are collapsing across not just Japan, but also the Western world in general, including the US. Now, what does that tell us? Well, remember, the Ponzi scheme, the whole global financial system is a Ponzi scheme that's based on ever expanding piles of debt. What we've got right now is a rejection of said debt. So that means that the Ponzi scheme cannot continue. Right now, they are issuing long bonds of 20, 30, 40 years, and they are going no bid. And this isn't just in Japan, like I said, it's also in the US. And the US is the holder of the global reserve currency, the dollar. So, what does it mean if people are no longer willing to accept dollars or pounds or euros or yen? And where still the existing debt is being rejected also. So, people are selling the old debt. Well, of course, that's the end of a Ponzi scheme if you cannot have more participants. And in this instance, more participants means more appetite for debt. If you can't expand the debt, and the pre-existing debt is being sold off and people are rushing out of it and going into things like gold and silver and platinum and to real assets, well, that's game over. You are on a countdown until the collapse of the system. So Japan is really the bellwether in this because, like I said, their debt market is a behemoth in terms of size because they've been a zombie nation, let's face it, since the 1990s when the bubble burst. Now, what they're trying to do is to keep this whole scheme going, and yet they've run out of solutions in Japan because the currency is now collapsing too. And it says Japan is considering buying back some super long dated government bonds issued in the past at low interest rates. So, what they're essentially saying, the Bank of Japan is saying, well, what options do we have? Well, more of the same. So, they're just going to do more of the same. That's all they can do. But in this instance, they're going to try and buy back the older bonds. So, let's say you've got a 30-year bond that's issued with a yield of 1.5%, and now there's sovereign debt of 30 years that's issued with a yield of 3%. They say, we're going to buy back the old stuff. So you can sell the old stuff and then you can buy the new stuff. So it really is rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic over there in Japan. But like I said, we're all on the Titanic with them. Nobody's getting off. Well, actually, you can get off. You can get off if you find yourself a little gold lifeboat or maybe even a silver one or even a platinum one. Look at what platinum's doing right now. We had 40% over the last few weeks. It's a pretty crazy move that we're seeing. And again, These are all warning signs, but is anyone listening? Well, I think you're watching this show, you're probably listening. And it goes on to say the move would come on top of an expected government plan to trim issuance of super long bonds, such as those with 20, 30, or 40-year maturities. This doesn't sound like a plan to me. It sounds like desperation. Essentially, the Bank of Japan saying, we'll continue doing what we've always done, which is buy up all of the debt. And the government of Japan is saying, and we'll try not to issue as much debt. That's the plan. That's the solution. That tells us they've run out of ideas. Maybe they can fund the government in terms of short dated debt, which is what the US tried to do with Janet Yellen, but it didn't fix the problem and it's not going to fix Japan's problem. There's no way they can issue less debt for the simple reason they cannot fund the elderly going into retirement. They've got a demographic bomb that has already gone off. And so there's not enough tax receipts, and you've got an aging population who are already in desperation. And they actually own a lot of Japan's bonds as well. Because after the Nikkei bubble collapsed, they thought, well, what's the safest asset we can hold? I know, we'll buy these long dated government bonds that have suppressed yields. Fantastic. And of course, with inflation back now, the price and value of those bonds has collapsed. So Japan's really on a cliff edge, and that's why I think we should be watching what happens over there, because what happens in Japan is going to happen everywhere. Now let's take a look at this next one, which is showing us the consequences in terms of the Japanese economy from having the impotent Japanese central bank and the even more impotent government. And I would say maybe the nation itself is now impotent, because we know the birth rate has plummeted. I think it's the lowest on record. So there's a lot of impotency going on over there. But yeah, let's face it, Japan is in some seriously deep waters, and the everyday man and woman is hurting. That's probably why they're not having children. And they can no longer even afford to buy their own staple food. Just think about that for a second. It's like the British no longer being able to afford fish and chips. I think we're getting close to that now. I've heard it's pretty crazy in terms of prices for fish and chips in the UK. Well, the same thing's happening in Japan, and they've actually got a rice shortage now as well. And the government is having to go into their strategic rice reserves. I'm not lying. That's what's happening. Let's read what it says here. It says, within a few minutes of the doors opening, the Farm Produce Cooperative in Atami, a seaside town in southwest of Tokyo, had completely sold out of subsidized Japanese rice. 46-year-old Yujiro Osaki said this will only last us a couple of weeks. He was one of the dozens of people who had queued up for a 3-kilogram bag, just a few dollars cheaper than the supermarket price for rice of the same quality. It's a ridiculous situation for Japan to be in. Well, of course it is. It's kind of crazy to think that the nation famed for its rice, for its sushi, is having to sell subsidized rice to its citizens. But I can only imagine how bad this is going to get when those pensioners are going to have to try and fund themselves going into an inflationary death spiral, whilst you have a collapsing bond market, when also their assets are pretty much made up of that collapsing bond market. And I don't think house prices are going to save them over in Japan as well. You've got tens of millions of houses that are unoccupied because they've got a demographic collapse. So in the West, you've got people who, for now at least on paper, have some unrealized gains on their housing. That's going to disappear when the bonds collapse. But for now, at least, it looks like they're wealthy when they look at the price and the value of their house. So maybe they could sell that. Maybe they could actually do something with that money before the bond market collapses. But in Japan, they don't even have that. So it's going to get way, way worse. And, Japan, people think of it, oh, it's this place of Zen Buddhism. It's a very peaceful and disciplined society. And they're famous for being willing to share the pain. That's kind of true. But also, look at Japan's history, let's say pre 1945. It's not quite so Zen and it's not quite so Buddhist. There were some pretty dark parts of that, and they were famed for their militarism. So, Japan could really be the place where we see something unexpected. We could see riots. There was the rice riots of, I think it was 1919, I want to say. Go back and look on Wikipedia, you'll find it. But we could see something quite explosive over there. If you keep turning the screw tighter and tighter, and you get lots of unemployed young people, which is also what's happening in Japan, then you've got an elderly population that cannot feed and clothe itself anymore. Well, at some point, you're going to see something pretty crazy. It's what we saw with the French Revolution. And I think Japan could be the place where we see something really unexpected. But whatever we see in Japan, mark my words, it will be 1,000 times worse in the US and the UK. Now, it says the average price of a 60-kilogram bag of rice harvested in 2024 reached an all-time high of 26,400 yen, which is $184. That's crazy. We're not talking about a vintage wine here. We're not talking about a collectible or a piece of art. It's rice. It's a 60-kilogram bag of rice and it's $184. Is that correct? That sounds insane to me. But that's what's happening. Now, they're already starting to blame the hoarders, which is a telltale sign that they are screwed, that they have no solutions. When they try and push the blame onto the hoarders, when in fact, of course, it's that they have 260% debt to GDP. They're printing the currency to oblivion. That's the problem, but they're going to blame the hoarders who are buying rice to try and escape the inflation. It says there is also being some hoarding by individuals and deliberate stock withholding by wholesalers. The government has tapped into its strategic rice reserve. Now, that's scary. If you're going into the strategic rice reserve, we're not talking about the strategic oil reserve, it's the strategic rice reserve. That's what you have over in Japan, and they're having to tap into it. So that's what you have really for natural disasters. But now they're tapping into it because of inflation. Now, I think this is going to happen across the world. I think we are on the precipice of seeing the same dynamics play out in Europe, in the US, in Great Britain, in Canada. And I think it's going to be pandemonium. I think it's going to be hell on earth when you have all of these nations that are filled with migrants, filled with people who have come across on our dime, on our taxes. They're living the life, the high life in those hotels. They're getting free food. They're getting free currency. They can go out and party. They can do what they want. What's going to happen to those people who are predominantly military age young men when they have the rug pulled on them? And then you've got medicated people. You've got people who are already on the breadline. It's going to be chaos. It's going to be chaos on the streets. It's going to be violent. And you don't want to be there. You don't want to be in the cities. Japan are pretty peaceful for now. But as I said, look back in their history. We could see the same things in Japan, but I just think it's going to be amplified far, far greater in the West. I mean, one of the things Japan doesn't have is people. It doesn't have a lot of people, so the chaos will be limited to the major cities, and they don't have a lot of immigrants. They don't like immigration over there because they're smart, let's face it. So Japan's pretty homogenous, so the problem's not going to be people versus people, it'll be people versus the government, so it will be more like a revolution when it really sparks out of control in Japan, if indeed it does. But in the West, I think it's going to be people versus people, and I can guess which people will be against which people. Okay, let's continue before I get too dystopian. It says Ishiba is setting up a special cabinet committee to discuss urgent rice policy reform. This is serious stuff. Japan's long-standing efforts to protect domestic farmers from outside competition, including limiting imports of foreign rice, means solving the problem will not be easy. A director at the Cannon Institute of Global Studies and an expert on Japan's rice market. So there you have it. The government has been tampering with the supply chains too. Many criticized the government's so-called set-aside program, which attempted to raise rice prices by incentivizing farmers not to grow. That sounds like a smart idea. The policy only ended in 2018. This is similar to what they're doing in Europe now, where they're saying, you know, that food that we need to survive, well, stop growing that damn stuff. Waste of time. Why don't you grow some solar panels, some wind farms that are going to be absolutely useless in a grand solar minimum? The same thing's happening, taking food offline, tampering with the natural market dynamics, and then you have a food shortage or a crisis. Now, imagine this in the West en masse. Going into a Greater Depression, going into a hyperinflationary event, going into a sovereign debt collapse, or the bursting of the everything bubble, all dynamics that are now in play, it is going to be the Greater Depression. It's going to be just like that, and the food shortages, in my opinion, will be a part of it. Now, that was the rice, but it's not just the rice. It's happening across the board, as you can see in this article, which is Japan inflation climbs at the fastest rate in more than 2 years. Japan's core inflation rate climbed at its fastest rate in more than 2 years in April, piling pressure on the Bank of Japan as it seeks to normalize the country's interest rates. Well, I am skeptical of that one. I don't think you're normalizing those interest rates when you've got debt to GDP of 260%, a collapsing currency, and you've got no one to buy the debt but yourself. So yeah, there's no normalizing that. There's no tapering a Ponzi, as they say. Core inflation, which excludes fresh food but includes energy prices, rose 3.5% year on year earlier last month. Official data showed on Friday, exceeding the 3.2% pace of growth in March. Now, of course, if that's the numbers they're giving, you can at least double that one. But this is just the tip of an iceberg for Japan because they've also got this the lowest birth rate in 125 years. They have a demographic cliff edge, which is just going to compound all of the above. Everything that I've been discussing is going to be compounded by the fact that Japanese people no longer want to have sex with one another, or if they do, they don't want to have babies. And it says here the number of babies born in Japan last year fell to the lowest level since records began 125 years ago as the country's demographic crisis deepens. Japan recorded 720,000 births in 2024, but also they had 1.6 million deaths. That means the population shrank last year by 900,000 people. Now, by the end of the 2000s, so by the time we get to 2100, Japan could in fact cease to exist. And that's not hyperbole. That's literal because the population is collapsing so fast that it will have shrank by 50% by the time we get to the end of this century. Now, what does that mean for a nation? Well, it means the end. It spells the end of a nation. And I don't know how you fix that because let's face it, what you're going to do, turn Japan into sub-Saharan Africa and just import a load of people that are going to live in your temples and play around with the statues? I don't think so. Nobody wants that. So yeah, what's going to happen? I have no clue. I think they're going to have to bring across a lot of people from neighboring Asian regions. Maybe that's how they're going to solve it. They're going to try and incentivize it. They've got ghost towns. They've got millions and millions of pieces of property that nobody's living in. And apparently you can buy them for next to nothing. Or in fact, I think they're giving some away to young people saying, listen, just come and live here because we've got a ghost town and the infrastructure is going to fail. Who's going to run the system? Who's going to care for the elderly? And what's going to happen to the millions of young people that are still there, but they have no jobs? And they've got no future because the debt crisis is going to happen. So for me, this is just another sign that we are definitely heading into what Doug Casey calls the Great Depression. And remember, Japan actually owns more US debt than any other nation. So what's going to happen when they can no longer fund their own debt markets? Well, they're going to get all of their investment firms to sell US debt and force that capital back home to buy Japanese debt. And I think the same thing's going to happen across the West. It's the final stage in this journey when they can no longer fund themselves. So they just loot anyone and everyone to just give themselves a few more months even of the Ponzi scheme. And that's where we're at. So your pension funds, if you're in the West, yes, they're going to loot them. They're going to force it into government debt. They're going to force it into any boondoggle or crazy scheme that they want. And you won't have any say in it if your capital is trapped in the system. And that's where capital controls come in. They're going to force you to be trapped in the system. So we really are heading now into the Great Depression. And I think the food shortages, the conflict, the chaos, it's all going to unravel. And that will be what takes us to the big reset, which I expect to be over and done with by around 2030. So the next 5 years, they're going to be interesting. So I think we're going to leave it there for this one, my friends. Thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to check out my audio newsletter and my members only articles, please do so over on Substack. I'm going to be doing an audio newsletter all about capital controls in the coming weeks. So if you're interested or concerned about that, you can look out for that over in the members section. Of course, I do have free content over there as well, so go check that out as well. In closing, have a fantastic rest of the week. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.